The clock ticked past 9 p.m., and the silence in my house felt heavier than usual. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the perfectly frosted lemon cake I'd bought earlier in the day. Two candles, 1 and 5, stood stiff and ridiculous in the center, like they were mocking me. 51. Not a milestone, not a number anyone celebrates with fireworks or a surprise dinner, but still, it was my birthday. And for the fourth year in a row, my son Drew hadn't called. Not a text, not a voicemail, not even an accidental like on a social media post. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until it slipped out in a shaky sigh. I reached for my phone, checked the signal, then the battery, then the missed calls list. Nothing. I had messaged him 2 days ago, just a casual, "Hey, how's the week going?" Hope work isn't too crazy. He'd seen it. The read receipt glared back like a cruel stamp of indifference. He hadn't replied. 4 years, 4 birthdays, a consistent pattern of being forgotten. Each year I'd made an excuse. He's busy, maybe he's planning a late surprise, maybe he doesn't like birthdays. But deep down, the excuses had thinned into a fragile layer of hope I no longer believed in. I glanced around the house. It was cleaner than it needed to be, every surface wiped down twice. The table was set for two, even though I knew only I would be sitting there. I had cooked his favorite, chicken marsala with garlic mashed potatoes, just in case he showed up, just in case. When did I become the kind of woman who waited for scraps of love? My fingers brushed against the linen napkin, folded neatly beside the empty plate. I felt foolish, dressing up the house for someone who wasn't coming. But it wasn't about hope anymore. It was about ritual, habit, a mother's muscle memory. I picked up the knife and cut into the cake, the soft sponge offering no resistance. I placed a slice onto the plate meant for him. I wanted to pretend he was there just for a moment, but the seat across from me stayed empty, and the illusion shattered before it began. He used to call me every week. Even after he moved to Seattle, we'd talk about his job, his girlfriend, his dog. Then the calls became texts, then fewer, then silence. When his father died 6 years ago, something shifted between us, like a thread had snapped and neither of us knew how to tie it back. I blamed myself more than I should have. Maybe I was too smothering. Maybe I talked too much about the past. Maybe he saw me as a reminder of things he wanted to forget. But how could a mother know where the line was between love and need? There was a knock at the door. For a split second, my heart leapt. But when I opened it, it was Marla, my neighbor and oldest friend. She held up a bottle of wine and wore a smile that was far too understanding. "I figured you might need this," she said, stepping inside. "I told you not to make a fuss," I murmured, trying to smile. "And I never listened," she replied, setting the bottle down. "Still nothing from Drew?" I shook my head. Marla's eyes softened. She knew. She'd watched me unravel year by year, each birthday another fray in my once tightly wound self. "You deserve better than this, Elle," she said quietly. "I'm his mother," I replied, as if that explained everything. She sat across from me, reached for my hand. "Being his mother doesn't mean you deserve to be forgotten." I nodded, though I didn't fully believe her. The guilt was too loud in my chest. I had raised him with love, yes, but also with a certain desperation. After Carl died, Drew was all I had left, and in holding on so tightly, maybe I'd driven him away. Marla poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat in the flickering kitchen light, the untouched cake between us like a monument to absence. Later, after she'd left and the house returned to silence, I pulled out the small lockbox from the closet. It was old, the paint chipped at the edges. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years: Carl's will, the deed to the house, a copy of my own living trust. I had almost forgotten about the clause Carl insisted we include. It was his idea, a quiet fail-safe, a final act of protection. Back when Drew had just started showing signs of detachment, Carl had worried aloud. He believed in fairness, but he also believed in love as a condition of legacy. "If he forgets what you mean to him," Carl had said, "then he doesn't deserve the fruits of everything you've endured." I'd called it dramatic at the time, cold even. But now I wasn't so sure. The clause was simple. If by the age of 35 Drew failed to show consistent and meaningful connection with me, the majority of the estate would be redirected to a charitable cause in Carl's name. I had the discretion to activate or dissolve it. I'd never thought I'd use it. But tonight, something inside me settled. Not in anger, not even in revenge, just clarity. I'd spent years trying to win back my son's affection, like it was a prize I had to earn rather than something freely given. I had sacrificed sleep, health, money, dignity, and all I ever received was silence. I put the papers back in the box and locked it again. My birthday had always been just a day, a mark on the calendar, but tonight it felt like something more. A reckoning, a mirror, a line in the sand. I walked back to the kitchen, blew out the candles that had burned halfway down. The flame flickered once before vanishing, and with it, so did my last excuse. I've been told silence is peaceful. That quiet is a balm to a noisy world. But when you're raised in a house where silence is weaponized, it never feels like peace. It feels like a cage. My mother, Lorraine, was a master of stillness. Her presence filled a room without words. She believed in order, not affection, obedience, not conversation. Her idea of love was a clean house and folded laundry. Praise was doled out in narrowed nods. Affection was weakness. Emotion was failure. My father left when I was 9. At least that's the year his body left. His mind had been gone long before that. A traveling salesman turned full-time ghost, he only showed up for holidays, and even then he seemed allergic to eye contact. I don't remember the last thing he said to me, which is ironic because I spent years trying to earn a sentence from him. After he left, my mother never spoke of him again. His pictures disappeared from the walls, his name was swallowed by silence. She rewrote our history with a tight mouth and iron discipline, raising me to be unshakable, invulnerable, invisible. I learned early that crying was a punishable offense. "You want something to cry about?" she'd hiss. I'd shake my head, swallowing emotion like poison. She had a way of looking at me like I was already a disappointment. I wasn't enough, but I was too much. Too sensitive, too needy, too loud, too emotional. I stopped laughing by the time I turned 11. I stopped asking questions by 12. She raised me to serve. I washed dishes with silent precision, cleaned baseboards on my knees every Saturday morning. By high school, I was cooking full dinners and doing the laundry while she rested after work. And I never complained. It wasn't allowed. A woman's job, she'd say, is to make life easier for everyone else. That line buried itself deep inside me, like a root system winding through my bones. Even now, I can hear her voice when I wake up. Chiding, cold, unrelenting. I learned to measure my worth in the satisfaction of others. And later, when I became a wife and mother, I didn't know any other way to love. Carl was different, at first. He was the first man who looked at me like I had something to say worth hearing. We met at a church barbecue when I was 23, and he asked me if I believed in fate. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. He was gentle, soft-spoken, a man who didn't raise his voice and didn't raise his hand. That felt like a miracle. We married 6 months later. Carl was never cruel, but he was quiet, and in that silence my wounds festered. He avoided conflict like it might kill him. When I cried, he offered me a tissue, not a conversation. When I worried aloud about Drew, he'd rub my back and say, "He'll come around." He thought his silence was love. And maybe it was, but I needed more than quiet companionship. Still, I told myself I was lucky. He didn't hit. He didn't cheat. He showed up every night. That was enough, wasn't it? That's what my mother would have said. But what I needed was someone to help me unlearn the lies she'd planted. When Drew was born, I promised myself he'd never know the cold I knew. I held him close, sang to him even when he couldn't understand the words. I told him I loved him every day. I gave him what I thought I never had, undivided attention, bottomless sacrifice. But I didn't know how to give him boundaries, or space, or teach him to respect emotional labor. I gave without asking for anything in return. I modeled servitude, not mutuality. And when he started pulling away, I clung harder, trying to outlove the distance. Now in hindsight, I see the blueprint. My mother raised me to disappear. I raised my son to believe I was already gone. Tonight, after the birthday that broke me, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet again. I found myself wandering into the study, pulling books off shelves like I was searching for something I couldn't name. And then I found it. It was tucked inside Carl's old copy of Leaves of Grass, pages yellowed with age. A folded envelope, my name scrawled in his neat, familiar handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, the weight of the paper suddenly heavier than I remembered. Inside was a letter, written in the last year of his life. Elle, if you're reading this, it means you're still here and I'm not. I never told you everything I should have. I guess I thought we had time. Or maybe I didn't want to believe what I saw, that you gave more than you got, that Drew, that he might one day forget what you meant to him. So I made a choice, a hard one. I worked with Michael, our lawyer, to add a clause to the estate. It's simple. If Drew fails to show consistent love and care toward you by his 35th birthday, the majority of the estate will not go to him. It'll go to a foundation in your name. I know this might seem harsh, but I couldn't stand the thought of you. I've been told silence is peaceful. That quiet is a balm to a noisy world. But when you're raised in a house where silence is weaponized, it never feels like peace. It feels like a cage. My mother, Lorraine, was a master of stillness. Her presence filled a room without words. She believed in order, not affection, obedience, not conversation. Her idea of love was a clean house and folded laundry. Praise was doled out in narrowed nods. Affection was weakness. Emotion was failure. My father left when I was 9. At least that's the year his body left. His mind had been gone long before that. A traveling salesman turned full-time ghost, he only showed up for holidays, and even then he seemed allergic to eye contact. I don't remember the last thing he said to me, which is ironic because I spent years trying to earn a sentence from him. After he left, my mother never spoke of him again. His pictures disappeared from the walls, his name was swallowed by silence. She rewrote our history with a tight mouth and iron discipline, raising me to be unshakable, invulnerable, invisible. I learned early that crying was a punishable offense. "You want something to cry about?" she'd hiss. I'd shake my head, swallowing emotion like poison. She had a way of looking at me like I was already a disappointment. I wasn't enough, but I was too much. Too sensitive, too needy, too loud, too emotional. I stopped laughing by the time I turned 11. I stopped asking questions by 12. She raised me to serve. I washed dishes with silent precision, cleaned baseboards on my knees every Saturday morning. By high school, I was cooking full dinners and doing the laundry while she rested after work. And I never complained. It wasn't allowed. A woman's job, she'd say, is to make life easier for everyone else. That line buried itself deep inside me, like a root system winding through my bones. Even now, I can hear her voice when I wake up, chiding, cold, unrelenting. I learned to measure my worth in the satisfaction of others. And later, when I became a wife and mother, I didn't know any other way to love. Carl was different, at first. He was the first man who looked at me like I had something to say worth hearing. We met at a church barbecue when I was 23, and he asked me if I believed in fate. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. He was gentle, soft-spoken, a man who didn't raise his voice and didn't raise his hand. That felt like a miracle. We married 6 months later. Carl was never cruel, but he was quiet, and in that silence my wounds festered. He avoided conflict like it might kill him. When I cried, he offered me a tissue, not a conversation. When I worried aloud about Drew, he'd rub my back and say, "He'll come around." He thought his silence was love. And maybe it was, but I needed more than quiet companionship. Still, I told myself I was lucky. He didn't hit. He didn't cheat. He showed up every night. That was enough, wasn't it? That's what my mother would have said. But what I needed was someone to help me unlearn the lies she'd planted. When Drew was born, I promised myself he'd never know the cold I knew. I held him close, sang to him even when he couldn't understand the words. I told him I loved him every day. I gave him what I thought I never had, undivided attention, bottomless sacrifice. But I didn't know how to give him boundaries, or space, or teach him to respect emotional labor. I gave without asking for anything in return. I modeled servitude, not mutuality. And when he started pulling away, I clung harder, trying to outlove the distance. Now, in hindsight, I see the blueprint. My mother raised me to disappear. I raised my son to believe I was already gone. Tonight, after the birthday that broke me, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet again. I found myself wandering into the study, pulling books off shelves like I was searching for something I couldn't name. And then I found it. It was tucked inside Carl's old copy of Leaves of Grass, pages yellowed with age. A folded envelope, my name scrawled in his neat, familiar handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, the weight of the paper suddenly heavier than I remembered. Inside was a letter, written in the last year of his life. Elle, if you're reading this, it means you're still here and I'm not. I never told you everything I should have. I guess I thought we had time. Or maybe I didn't want to believe what I saw, that you gave more than you got, that Drew, that he might one day forget what you meant to him. So I made a choice, a hard one. I worked with Michael, our lawyer, to add a clause to the estate. It's simple. If Drew fails to show consistent love and care toward you by his 35th birthday, the majority of the estate will not go to him. It'll go to a foundation in your name. I know this might seem harsh, but I couldn't stand the thought of you. There's a kind of grief no one talks about. The grief of loving someone who's still alive, still breathing, still walking this earth, but no longer reachable. That's what it feels like to be Drew's mother now. Like mourning a son who never died, only drifted so far away he might as well have. I remember the first time I held him. He was quiet, not one of those babies who screamed upon entering the world. He blinked up at me, solemn and wide-eyed, like he was already studying me. From the very start, I thought he was extraordinary. I gave him everything, the best I had, the best I could become. Late nights rocking him through colic screams, making faces to get one of his early laughs. Years of school lunches packed with little notes. You've got this. You're my hero. And afternoons spent sitting in bleachers cheering him on, whether he was good at the sport or not. I attended every parent-teacher conference, stayed up to help with science projects, and cried with pride at every tiny award ceremony. He was my life's work, the living, breathing embodiment of love and sacrifice. Carl was always quieter in parenting, present but background. I was the one who rearranged my career, took on freelance work so I could be home. I was the one who baked the birthday cakes, remembered every allergy, every fear. When he had nightmares, it was my bed he ran to. When he had triumphs, it was my arms he dove into. Somewhere along the way, motherhood stopped being a role. It became my entire identity, and then it shifted. It started after high school. Subtle at first, less talking, more nodding, less asking for advice, more dismissive smiles. When he left for college, I expected distance. What I didn't expect was how fast the warmth drained from his voice. I went from being mom to just Elle, from being his compass to being an obligation. The phone calls became shorter, then less frequent. When we spoke, he always sounded rushed. "I'm just so busy, Mom. You wouldn't understand." I offered to visit. He brushed it off. I sent care packages. He never acknowledged them. At first, I blamed the usual suspects: new environment, peer pressure, trying to forge independence. I told myself it was a phase. But when he graduated and didn't invite me to the ceremony, I stopped pretending it was temporary. When I confronted him gently about it, his reply was curt. "It wasn't a big deal. You didn't need to come all the way out for a boring speech." He hadn't even told me the date. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting in the living room for hours just staring at the silence. That was the first time I cried for the version of Drew I had lost. Over the next few years, he made his expectations clear without ever saying them aloud. I was not to call too often, not to show up unannounced, not to ask too many questions. He wanted my presence curated, manageable, distant. But when he needed something, I was still his first call. A $700 loan when his car broke down, a month of rent when he switched jobs, emotional support when he and his first girlfriend split. I gave it all, without hesitation, without condition. It wasn't just maternal instinct, it was desperation. I thought if I kept proving my love, maybe he'd start to see it again. I thought if I kept sacrificing, eventually he'd notice. But with every favor came a colder tone, a sharper edge. If I ever hesitated, he'd say things like, I just thought you wanted to help. Or worse, you're the one who raised me to ask. Guilt became a rope he pulled whenever he needed me closer, just not too close. Still, I kept reaching out, inviting him for holidays, sending him articles that reminded me of him, offering recipes he loved as a child. His replies were clinical, often delayed by days. Thanks. Busy. Maybe next year. The last time he visited, he brought a friend, Kendra. She was cool, composed, and vaguely amused by everything I said. They stayed 2 days, barely spoke to me outside of meals, and left early with the excuse of a work thing. That night, I found a wine glass in the sink still full, untouched. He hadn't even said goodbye before leaving. I replay those visits in my head like crime scenes, looking for what I did wrong. Was I too eager? Too affectionate? Did I ask too many questions about his life? Did I talk too much about the past? Sometimes I wonder if it was because I showed him too much love, an overcompensation for what I never received. Did I smother him? Did I teach him that women give and never ask for anything back? My mother's voice echoes inside me still. You're too emotional. Men don't like that. And maybe I passed that lesson on, unintentionally, through every act of self-erasure I called mothering. Maybe he learned that love means one person sacrifices and the other simply receives. Maybe that's what I modeled. Still, none of it justifies the way he treats me now. The way he speaks through silence, communicates through neglect. The way I am an afterthought unless he needs something. I remember his 5th birthday. He wanted a dinosaur cake, and I stayed up all night baking frosting, shaping each stegosaurus spike by hand. When he saw it, his face lit up like I'd handed him the moon. He hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would bruise. That boy is gone, and the man who replaced him barely looks back. And yet, I still wait for a text, a call, a scrap of warmth. I still sit by the window, hoping the car pulling into the driveway is his. Still bake his favorite cookies in December, even if I'm the only one who eats them. Still find myself defending him when others ask where he's been. Because I'm his mother. Because even now, with every silent birthday and every unanswered message, some part of me still believes I failed him. That maybe if I'd done one more thing right, he'd love me the way I love him. I noticed her eyes first. Kendra had that polished kind of stillness, like someone who knew exactly how she was perceived and was careful to keep the edges of herself out of focus. She smiled often, but never with her eyes. Her gaze reminded me of frosted glass, decorative, impenetrable. When Drew first mentioned her, it was in passing. She's in marketing, he said. Super driven, you'll like her. I wanted to believe him. I tried to. She came with him to Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I remember how her coat looked more expensive than anything in my closet, how her nails were perfect, how she never offered to help in the kitchen, but gave compliments that felt slightly off, just enough to feel observed, not appreciated. Drew became someone else around her, smoothed out, controlled. The way he spoke was calculated, as if every word had been reviewed. He didn't ask about me or the house or bring up childhood memories like he used to. And when I tried to reminisce, Kendra redirected the conversation, always just in time, always just enough to make me feel like I was interrupting something important. That visit left a strange residue on the house. After they left, I found a lipstick stain on a wine glass, a smear of foundation on a pillowcase in the guest room, traces of presence without connection. She hadn't looked around my home with interest, only evaluation. Everything about her felt clinical, like she was taking inventory. It wasn't until I pulled out the old photo albums that I felt the first jolt of clarity. I had been cleaning the hallway closet when one of the albums fell open on the floor. The page it landed on was from Drew's 7th birthday. Balloons, messy chocolate cake, Carl holding Drew up on his shoulders. I was behind them, smiling, half out of frame. Page after page, the story was the same. I was always the one taking the picture, always in the background, a presence without permanence. In most photos, Drew's eyes were bright, wild with childhood joy. My love was visible in the preparations, the decorations, the small things, but my face was often missing. And when I was there, it was like I was fading. There was one photo in particular that stopped me cold. Christmas 10 years ago. Carl, Drew, and me. except the frame had cracked and shifted slightly under the glass. My image had slipped, cut off at the edge. Only Carl and Drew remained, centered and preserved. That crooked photo haunted me more than the empty guest room. I sat with it for a long time, studying how the camera told a version of our family that was never quite accurate. A story where I was always at the margins, a story that mirrored how I felt now, cropped out of my own life. It was then I began journaling. At first, it was just scraps, dates, memories, feelings I hadn't dared say aloud. But the more I wrote, the more I began to see patterns. How Kendra's arrival coincided with the sharpest declines in communication. How Drew had started using phrases I'd never heard from him before. Words like boundaries, emotional labor, empathy fatigue, like someone had handed him a script for how to keep a parent at arm's length while appearing thoughtful. There were other things, too. Small inconsistencies. He once mentioned a conference in Phoenix, but his social media showed him in Cabo. He said he was broke one month, yet posted pictures at a Michelin-starred restaurant the next. I didn't want to think the worst, but something inside me had shifted since finding Carl's letter. I began checking my finances, not because I suspected anything, not really, but because the silence between us had grown so deep, it felt reckless not to verify what I still believed to be true. I logged into my bank account, pulled up old statements, and cross-referenced transfers. One line item jumped out, a recurring withdrawal labeled JE Services. I didn't recognize it. The payments had started 14 months ago, monthly, $600. I clicked deeper. The business was registered under Kendra's maiden name. My mouth went dry. I checked other records, my retirement fund, my health savings account. There were withdrawals I hadn't authorized, small enough to go unnoticed in the ebb and flow of bills and utilities, but cumulatively, thousands. I called the bank. They confirmed what I already knew. The withdrawals had been verified using a PIN reset I didn't initiate. When I asked for the device used, they listed an IP address registered in Seattle, Drew's City. The panic was sudden and sickening. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a fluke. But the puzzle pieces had started forming an undeniable shape. I reached out to Carl's old lawyer, Michael. We hadn't spoken in years, but he answered on the second ring. His voice cracked when I said my name. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. He told me he'd recently received a request from Drew for early access to the estate documents. Said he needed to prepare for transitions. When Michael declined, citing legal boundaries, Drew had become agitated and evasive. That phrase sat in my stomach like a stone. Agitated and evasive. Michael promised to send over the full documentation Carl had finalized, including the clause. I hung up, my hands shaking. Upstairs, I returned to the photo album and stared again at that broken frame. My image, cut off. A symbol of presence distorted into absence. Kendra hadn't just come into Drew's life. She'd studied mine. Whatever warmth remained between my son and me had been siphoned, just like my savings. Slowly, methodically, and with the kind of detachment that only someone truly removed could perform. And Drew had let it happen. Had maybe orchestrated it himself. The betrayal ran deeper than theft. It was the realization that I had become nothing more than a resource to be managed. Not a mother, not a person, just an asset. My love had been unguarded. My heart had been an open house, and they had walked through it like visitors who never planned to stay. But now, I was no longer unaware. The shadows had started to take shape. Carl always had a quiet way of suggesting things, so soft it almost felt like a breeze passing through a closed room. The day he brought up the clause, we were in the kitchen. It was raining. He'd just made coffee, the kind I liked, dark roast with too much sugar. I remember because his hands trembled slightly as he stirred in the cream, and Carl's hands didn't shake unless something was weighing heavy on him. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, carefully setting the mugs down. I smiled, trying to lighten the air. "Is this where you confess to a secret gambling addiction?" But he didn't laugh. "It's about Drew," he said, and the humor dissolved instantly. He reached into a folder on the table, pulling out 2 typed pages. Legal, sterile, but what he said next pulled breath straight from my lungs. "I've spoken to Michael," he began, voice tight. "I've added a conditional clause to our estate plan. For Drew, I remember blinking at him, trying to grasp the words. A clause? I repeated, confused. What kind of clause? Carl hesitated. It stipulates that he will only inherit the full estate if, by his 35th birthday, he demonstrates a sustained and meaningful relationship with you. I froze. The words felt foreign, clinical, cruel even. You're tying love to money? I said, more hurt than angry. That's manipulation, Carl. He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. It's not about control, he said quickly. It's about protection. You've given everything to him, Elle, and I've seen what you refuse to see. He's pulling away. Not because he's busy, but because he doesn't see you anymore. I wanted to scream, to call him paranoid. But deep down, a tremor of truth was already shaking loose. Carl continued. It's not about punishment. It's not even about inheritance, not really. It's about a message, a measure. If he can love you for you, not because there's something to gain, then the clause becomes irrelevant. But if he can't, he paused, then maybe he never deserved it in the first place. I stood there, stunned. My gut reaction was to reject it outright. This wasn't how love worked. Love was unconditional, wasn't it? I can't agree to this, I whispered. It's not fair. Carl looked tired, older than he was. What's not fair, he said gently, is watching you be erased in real time while we do nothing. I may not know how to fix it, but I can at least try to prevent it from becoming your final chapter. He had always been more observer than participant, especially when it came to emotional conflict. He rarely confronted Drew directly, never raised his voice, never demanded respect. I used to resent that quiet passivity, but in that moment, I saw it for what it was, grief in slow motion. He'd been grieving the same loss I had, but he wore it differently. Where I clung, he prepared. Where I hoped, he planned. Eventually I relented, not because I agreed. I Zrenia, but because I couldn't argue with the fear in his eyes. We signed the amendment together, the ink barely dry before we locked it away. I buried the memory of that conversation as soon as he passed. For years, I convinced myself I'd never need to use it. That Drew would find his way back, that his coldness was just a phase, a hard edge softened by time. I held on to that belief like a life raft, even as birthdays passed in silence and his visits felt more like transactions than reunions. But now, that clause, once an act of desperation, feels like the only justice left to me. Not revenge, not spite, just balance. A boundary Carl built for a woman who had never learned how to make her own. I reread the terms last night. The language was precise. Drew's inheritance was contingent not on performance or polite obligation, but on an active reciprocal relationship, clearly evidenced by emotional investment, sustained communication, and voluntary acts of care. It didn't require perfection, just presence, just love. And still, he failed to meet it. This clause, once something I resented, has become my spine, the line between dignity and desperation. A man I loved gave me this gift before he left, knowing I wouldn't ask for it myself. A quiet act of rebellion against erasure. He saw me, even when my son no longer did. Healing is never cinematic. It doesn't arrive in grand gestures or thunderous epiphanies. It creeps in quietly, showing up on ordinary days, in the pause before an apology that never comes, or in the moment you choose not to blame yourself for someone else's silence. I made the call on a Tuesday. My hands trembled dialing the number, the same way they had when I used to call Drew, back when I still hoped he'd answer. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was for me. The receptionist's voice was warm. "Doctor, Lena Harrow's office. How can I help?" That was the beginning. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Validation, maybe. A place to set down the weight I'd been carrying for decades. The guilt, the grief, the questions I no longer knew how to ask without sounding bitter. Dr. Lena was in her early 50s with cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness that made you feel safe. Not soft, but grounded. She didn't use a clipboard or sit behind a desk. She sat across from me like a witness, not a judge. Our first session, I talked in circles, about Drew, about Carl, about my mother. I apologized so many times I lost count. I'm sorry, I said, again, mid-sentence. She stopped me gently. What are you sorry for? And I didn't know. Not really. That's when she introduced me to the word I had never allowed myself to own: boundaries. You don't have to earn the right to exist, she told me. You don't have to be useful to be loved. The idea hit like a wave. I'd spent my whole life trying to prove I was worth keeping. As a daughter, as a wife, as a mother. I gave, and when that wasn't enough, I gave more. Dr. Lena helped me see that what I'd called love was often survival, that what I'd accepted as normal was actually emotional neglect dressed in expectation. She helped me name things: manipulation, guilt-tripping, gaslighting. I had thought they were just parts of parenting, just rough patches, just the toll of being needed. But they had names, and when things have names, they lose their power to hide. I started journaling again, not just scribbling memories, but writing with intention, mapping patterns, connecting dots. I read entries aloud in our sessions, sometimes through tears, sometimes through silence so thick it felt like another person in the room. I used to think love was about sacrifice, I said one day. Now I think I just wanted to be chosen. Dr. Lena nodded, her gaze steady. You can choose yourself now. So I did. I started small. I stopped sending Drew money. I didn't apologize for taking time to rest. I told Marla I needed space from her constant reassurances that Drew meant well. I changed the locks on my house, not because I feared anything immediate, but because the act felt symbolic. Mine, final. And with every boundary, I felt lighter, more awake. I stopped thinking of myself as a failed mother. I started thinking of myself as a woman who had survived. I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't flinch. My skin sagged a little more. My eyes had new lines, but I saw clarity. A self I'd buried beneath years of caregiving and conditional love. Then the call came. It was from Julia, an old friend of Carl's who still practiced law. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but she didn't waste time on small talk. Elle, she said, her voice clipped with urgency. Has Drew been in contact with you lately? Not really, I replied. Why? She exhaled sharply. He reached out to a colleague of mine, someone in elder law. He was inquiring about your mental competency, your health insurance, whether your estate has a medical proxy in place. The words didn't register at first. He's trying to have me declared unfit? That's what it sounds like. Or at least, he's laying groundwork. I felt my throat close. He thinks I'm a liability. No, Julia said softly. He sees you as an obstacle. It was more than betrayal. It was dehumanization, as if I were no longer a person to protect, but a possession to manage. I thought back to every moment I had questioned my sanity over the last few years. Every time I wondered if I was being too dramatic, too sensitive, too emotional. Drew had been counting on that doubt, but he had miscalculated one thing. I wasn't the same woman anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table. No cake, no candles, no performative hopes. Just the quiet hum of my own breath and the journal in front of me. I wrote until my fingers ached. Wrote about the boy I raised. Wrote about the woman I became. Wrote about the difference between love and loyalty, between guilt and grace. When I finished, I didn't cry. I closed the journal, stood up, and felt the floor steady beneath me in a way it hadn't for years. This was my awakening, and I wasn't going back. I set the table with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Polished silverware, crisp linen napkins, my mother's china I hadn't used in over a decade. Every glass gleamed under the afternoon light, every place setting perfectly aligned. The house smelled of rosemary chicken and roasted vegetables, a quiet symphony of domestic warmth. It wasn't for him, not really. It was for me, a final offering, a final act of clarity before the curtain dropped. Drew arrived 10 minutes late. No flowers, no gift, just a muted "Hey, Mom" as he stepped inside, barely glancing around the room. He looked good, put together, navy sport coat, button-down shirt, expensive shoes. Polished, just like his words always were, but his eyes flicked over the table with something like suspicion. "Wow," he said, "this looks formal." I smiled thinly. "It's a birthday lunch." He blinked. "Yours?" I nodded, watching the flicker of something pass behind his face. Regret, maybe, or calculation. Right, happy birthday, he added without warmth. We sat. The silence between us swelled like a bruise. For the first few minutes, we made small talk. He talked about work, some new client he couldn't name, confidentiality agreements and all. I nodded in all the right places, refilled his water, passed the bread basket. I let him perform normalcy. And I waited. Then halfway through the meal, I said it. So I've been going through the estate paperwork, I said lightly, slicing into my chicken. There's a clause Carl added I'd forgotten about. Drew's fork paused midair. A clause? He repeated too quickly. I kept my tone even. Yes, something about conditions tied to inheritance. It's quite detailed. He set down his fork. Why are you bringing this up now? I tilted my head. Because you've been asking around about my health, my finances. His mouth tightened. The mask slipped just a little. Who told you that? You did, I said softly. With your actions. A beat of silence passed between us. The room suddenly felt colder, despite the warmth of the food and sunlit windows. I was just making sure things were in order, he said finally, in case something happened. That's not your responsibility, I replied, unless you think something should happen. He laughed. It wasn't amused, it was hollow, defensive. Jesus, Mom, you always think the worst of me. No, I said, setting down my napkin. I always thought the best of you. That's the problem. His eyes narrowed. All those years, I continued, I bent myself backward to be the mother you needed. I gave without asking. I showed up without being invited. I sacrificed my peace for your comfort. He looked away. And all you gave me, I said, voice steady now, was distance, guilt, silence dressed up as maturity. He exhaled, annoyed. This again? Yes, I said sharply. This again, because you never answered it the first time. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You're being dramatic. You always were. No, I said calmly. I was just the only one feeling anything. The words hung in the air, sharper than any argument we'd ever had. He blinked, and I could see the offense in his face. Not because I'd hurt him, but because I'd broken the script. I don't owe you my life, Mom. No, I agreed, but you do owe me honesty and respect and basic human decency. He scoffed. You're using this inheritance to punish me. That's what this is about, isn't it? I held his gaze. Carl added that clause to protect me, because even he saw it, the way you look through me, like I'm a burden, not a person. Drew's jaw tightened. Carl never said anything to me about it. Because he knew you wouldn't hear him, I said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loud with everything unspoken over the years. The birthdays missed, the messages ignored. The kindness repaid with absence. Then he laughed again, bitter this time. So that's it? You're cutting me out of your life over some feelings? I stood. No, Drew, I'm not cutting you out. You walked out years ago. I just finally stopped leaving the door open. His face hardened. You know what? Maybe you were never as good a mother as you think you were. The words hit, not because I believed them, but because I knew he did. I nodded slowly. Maybe I wasn't, but I loved you with everything I had, and if that's not enough for you, I'm done apologizing for it. He stood too, pushing back his chair with a loud scrape. So what now? You going to disown me? Write some letter to your lawyer and pretend that makes you a hero? No, I said, calm even as my heart pounded. I'm going to live the rest of my life knowing I don't have to beg my child to see me. I'm going to stop making excuses for your indifference. And if that means we walk away strangers, then at least I'll know I finally chose myself. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Good. Let him meet the version of me who no longer chases after the scraps of his affection. He grabbed his coat without another word and walked out the door. I didn't follow. There's a moment in healing when you realize the pain didn't start with you, but it's been living inside you all the same. I saw it clearly one morning, weeks after the confrontation with Drew. I was folding laundry, mundane, repetitive, comforting in its way, when my hands paused over a blouse I hadn't worn in years. Pale blue, buttoned up to the collar, ironed into perfection. My mother's favorite style. It hit me like a wave, how much of her I still carried. In the way I apologized before speaking, in the way I smiled through discomfort, in the way I raised Drew not with open hands, but clenched expectations, ones I'd inherited from a woman who'd never learned softness. That night, I sat down to write a letter I never intended to send. Dear Mother, you taught me how to endure, but you never taught me how to rest. You showed me how to serve, but not how to ask. You made me believe love was earned, not given. And I passed that on. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know better. I spent my life trying to be everything you weren't. And somehow, I still became a version of you. Silent, invisible, necessary but never celebrated. You gave me discipline. You gave me fear. You gave me rules. But you never gave me yourself. I forgive you, but I am not you, and I won't carry this any further. I folded the letter and walked it to the backyard. The air was cold, but I didn't shiver. I lit a match, held it under the paper until flames licked the corners, then dropped it into a metal basin. I watched it curl and blacken, the ink disappearing into ash. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like release. A few days later, I joined a support group at the local community center. I don't know what made me go. Curiosity, loneliness, maybe the growing need to speak my truth in a room that could hold it. The women were older, younger, tired, defiant, each with their own version of silence. One woman, Teresa, spoke of a daughter who hadn't called in 7 years. Another, Dana, shared how she'd raised 3 sons who only called when they needed money. I listened. Then I spoke about the birthdays forgotten, about the sun who once lit up at my arrival and now barely returned my messages, about the claws, the silence, the guilt, about the letter I burned and the version of myself I was trying to resurrect from the ashes. They nodded, some cried, no one flinched, and in that circle, something cracked open. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. We began meeting weekly. We talked, cried, drank bad coffee, shared stories about motherhood that didn't make it into greeting cards. There was laughter too, raw and unfiltered. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a decade. One night, I brought my journal, read a page aloud. The others clapped quietly, reverently, like I'd done something brave. Maybe I had. Because I was no longer just surviving my story. I was owning it. I was rewriting the legacy I'd been given, not with bitterness, but with truth. Then came the voicemail. It arrived one Friday morning just as I was heading out for groceries. My phone buzzed. Kendra's name flashed across the screen. A message, not a call. I pressed play, my stomach already tightening. Ella, it's Kendra. Don't ask how I got your number. Just listen. I shouldn't be calling you, but I don't agree with what Drew's doing. He's meeting with a lawyer next week. He's trying to build a case that you're mentally unfit, that you've been unstable. He's planning to challenge the will, said you've been paranoid, erratic, that you've had a breakdown. I froze. She continued, her voice low, almost ashamed. I don't want to be part of this anymore. I just thought you should know. He's not who you think he is. The message ended, and I stood in the kitchen, holding my phone like it was evidence in a crime I hadn't yet named. So that was the plan. Strip me of agency. Use my emotions, the ones I finally stopped hiding, as proof I couldn't manage my life. Frame clarity as instability, turn healing into madness. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was warfare. But what he didn't know, what Kendra clearly hadn't told him, was that I was no longer afraid of being seen as too much, no longer afraid of being called emotional, or erratic, or dramatic. Let him try. I had a therapist, I had documentation, I had a network of women who knew the difference between fragility and strength, and most of all, I had a voice now. He couldn't silence me with paperwork, not this time. There's a different kind of strength that comes when fear stops being your compass. When you finally stop spinning in the questions, why would he do this? What did I do wrong? And start asking, what do I do next? That's when clarity begins. The day after Kendra's voicemail, I called Michael. My voice didn't shake. I want to review every document tied to the estate, I told him. We need to reinforce the clause, and I want to add a new section, something ironclad. He didn't hesitate. I'll draft the amendments. Come in tomorrow. We spent 3 hours in his office. I signed forms with precision, annotated every section. We restructured the trust. Any challenge to the clause would now require a full psychological evaluation of both parties, not just me. Drew wouldn't see that coming. I also appointed a secondary executor, Julia, someone who'd seen this coming before I did, someone I trusted. After that, I changed all my passwords. I installed security cameras around the house, not because I feared physical intrusion, but because I wanted accountability. I began recording every conversation I had with Drew, every phone call, every request, not out of paranoia, out of preparation. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to him. I was outmaneuvering him. I met with Dr. Lena twice a week now, compiling a documented timeline of my mental health, progress reports, signed evaluations, evidence of wellness, resilience, stability. Each page, each entry became a shield. Paper shields, but shields nonetheless. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Kendra showed up at my door. She looked different. Pale, stripped of her composure, no designer coat, no lacquered nails, just jeans and a hoodie and eyes that no longer glittered with superiority. I almost didn't let her in, but something in her face, an echo of my own exhaustion perhaps, made me step aside. She sat at the kitchen table where Drew had once tried to dismantle my sense of reality. She didn't touch the tea I poured. She just stared at the steam, silent, until finally she said, "I'm sorry." I waited. "For not seeing it sooner," she added, "for letting it get this far." I said nothing. I wasn't ready to absolve her, but I was ready to listen. Kendra folded her hands. "He changed around me too, you know. It wasn't obvious at first. He was charming, attentive, successful, but slowly, he made me feel like I owed him everything, that without him, I was nothing." I didn't respond. The words were too familiar. "He isolates people," she said, eyes wet. "Subtly, he makes you think it's your idea to pull away from everyone else, and by the time you realize how alone you are, it's too late." A long pause passed. "I tried to leave 6 months ago," she confessed. "He convinced me I was unstable, that I needed him, that no one else would put up with me." She looked up. "Sound familiar?" I nodded. There it was, the silent bond of the used and discarded. Two women caught in the orbit of the same gravitational pull, finally speaking the same language. "I didn't call you to be a hero," she said. I thought if I gave you a warning, maybe I could feel like a person again." I still didn't know what to say, but when she stood to leave, I didn't stop her. Instead, I said, "If you want to testify, if it comes to that, I won't stop you." She nodded once and walked out the door. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close to truth. And that, for now, was enough. The table was dressed in gold and rust, the colors of late November and deliberate endings. Candles flickered in antique holders, catching reflections in the wine glasses. The roast turkey sat at the center, a ceremonial centerpiece more than a meal. It was the kind of table that looked like forgiveness, but tonight it was a stage. It was Thanksgiving, the last one in a way. Drew arrived precisely on time, not early, not late, just calculated enough to seem respectful. He brought a bouquet of supermarket flowers and a bottle of wine I didn't drink. He kissed my cheek, asked about the turkey, complimented the linens. The performance had begun. I'd invited a few others to make it feel less intimate, less exposed. Marla, a neighbor from the center, and Julia, who now held my legal proxy. We chatted lightly, passed dishes, sipped cider, and tried not to lean into the weight of the evening. But beneath it all, tension pulsed like a second heartbeat. Drew was charming, smiling, attentive. He asked how I'd been feeling, even helped clear dishes between courses. It was the first time in years he looked me in the eye while talking. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not joy, just distance, like watching someone I once knew play a role he hadn't quite rehearsed well enough. He leaned in during dessert, voice warm. "This is really nice, Mom. It feels good to be here." I gave him a soft smile. I'm glad you came. He relaxed, mistaking politeness for surrender. But I wasn't surrendering. Not anymore. I looked around the room as coffee was poured. Marla was laughing at something Julia had said. The lights cast soft shadows against the window panes, and the wind whispered through the trees outside. The room felt full, but I had never been so certain of my own solitude and my own strength. For the first time, I wasn't aching for connection. I wasn't desperate to be chosen. I was whole. I stood slowly, tapping my glass with the side of a spoon. Thank you all for being here, I said. This dinner means more than it might appear. Not because it's a holiday, but because it marks something I've been preparing for. Drew's smile froze, eyes narrowing slightly. I continued. Most of you know that Carl and I wrote a clause into our estate, one tied to relational integrity, to love, not obligation. Drew's fork clinked against his plate as he set it down. The room quieted. That clause activates tonight, I said. He opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. I'm not here to debate it. I'm here to inform you of an amendment, one I made recently with full legal backing. Julia nodded, a quiet confirmation of what was to come. I took a deep breath. The estate will now be transferred upon my passing to the Havenwood Foundation, a nonprofit that supports women escaping domestic and emotional abuse. A few gasps, one stifled cough. Drew's jaw clenched. I continued, voice unwavering. But I'm also giving Drew a chance, a real one. If, over the course of one full year, he engages in consistent therapy, demonstrates growth, and builds a documented relationship with me, not performative, not transactional, but real, then the original clause may still stand. He stood now, too. Are you serious? Yes, I said quietly, dead serious. This is manipulative, he spat, the veneer of affection slipping completely. You're blackmailing me with my own future. No, I replied calmly. I'm offering you a chance to build something that should have existed without the threat of inheritance. He looked around the room as if expecting someone to come to his defense. No one did. You can't do this, he said. But I can, I said, and I have. Because I refuse to leave this world propping up the myth that motherhood means martyrdom, that I owe you everything while expecting nothing. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. This is pathetic. No, I said. This is boundaries, something neither of us ever learned. He stared at me, fury flickering in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, he schooled his face into neutrality. The performance resumed, but it was too late. Everyone had seen the slip. And more importantly, so had I. After dessert, he left quickly, claiming an early flight. He didn't look back as he walked down the porch steps. The silence after the door closed felt different this time. Not like abandonment, like liberation. I stood by the window and watched the wind whip through the branches. Behind me, the table still held the remnants of the meal. The wine, the crumbs, the scattered napkins. And at the center, untouched, was the place setting I had left for Carl. It wasn't grief anymore that filled my chest. It was clarity. I didn't need my son to prove my worth. I had already remembered who I was. The confrontation didn't happen the way I expected. Not in private, not over the phone. It happened in the center of my living room on a Sunday afternoon, surrounded by voices that had once called me family. I hadn't planned a formal announcement, but word travels fast in families with more opinions than boundaries. One cousin had heard about the clause changes from Julia, another had accidentally seen the foundation announcement online. Suddenly, I was hosting a gathering that felt less like a reunion and more like a tribunal. Drew arrived late again, this time with a hardened expression and not a trace of apology. He stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, scanning the room like a battlefield. Want to tell them what you've done? He asked, voice already teetering on rage. I stood near the bookshelf, calm but coiled. I've protected what your father and I built, and I've decided to honor it by making sure it goes where it's needed. You mean away from me? He snapped. You've decided I'm unworthy. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The room was already splitting down invisible lines, those who believed I had the right to decide my own future, and those who saw me as a maternal bank account with strings attached. You're sick, Drew continued, louder now. You need help. You're letting strangers manipulate you. Strangers? I echoed softly. You mean professionals? Lawyers? Therapists? People who actually listen when I speak? He moved closer, pointing a finger. You're rewriting history because you're lonely, because you didn't get what you wanted from me. I wanted love, I said. Not obedience, not guilt, just love. He sneered. Well, maybe you should have tried being someone people wanted to come home to. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone muttered, Jesus, Drew. But he didn't stop. He turned to the others, appealing for sympathy. She's making a spectacle, using the will to control me. Who does that to their own child? I could feel the tears pressing against the edges of my vision, but I didn't let them fall. I took a step forward, not to intimidate, just to stand tall. I did everything I could, I said, voice steady, and now I'm done proving my love to someone who only sees me as leverage. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Marla stood, quietly walked to my side. Then Julia. Then, to my surprise, Kendra, who had come without invitation but not without purpose, spoke from the doorway. She's not unstable, she said. She's finally awake. The silence that followed was different now, heavier. Drew's expression cracked, confusion, fury, and something else. Fear, not of me, of no longer having control. He stormed out. This time, I didn't just stay behind. I walked away too, mid-conversation, mid-argument, mid-history. I left the room, the house, the expectations that had trapped me in a role I no longer recognized. The keys to the house were cold in my palm. I laid them on the kitchen counter. The same counter where I'd once iced birthday cakes, where I'd written tuition checks, where I'd waited for calls that never came. I didn't look back. The moving truck arrived 2 days later. I packed fast. I didn't linger over memories. I didn't trace the edges of photographs. I didn't apologize to the walls. I left the drapes open, let the house breathe without me for the first time in 40 years. My new apartment was nothing special by anyone else's standards. Small, 2 rooms, modest view of a park. But it was mine. No ghosts in the closets, no shadows in the frames, just space, just light, just peace. I set up the kettle, stocked the fridge, and made the bed myself. The silence here didn't ache. It hummed. It welcomed. I lit a candle, wrote a journal entry, and watched the wind move the trees outside my window. No audience, no performance. Just me. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope. No return address. The handwriting was careful, almost timid, as if the sender wasn't sure whether they had the right to reach out. I opened it over morning tea, sunlight slanting across my small kitchen table. Dear Ms. Ellison, you don't know me, but a year ago your donation to Havenwood helped me find a place to sleep that didn't come with bruises. I was 19, scared, and convinced no one cared whether I lived or died. But because of you, I had a warm bed, a hot meal, and someone who asked my name without judgment. They told me the shelter expansion was made possible by a grant in memory of a woman's strength. They didn't mention you by name, but I found it later on a plaque near the garden. For Lorraine, who taught me what to survive and what to let go. I don't know who Lorraine was to you, but I hope she sees you now wherever she is. Thank you for giving me a second chance. I'm in school now studying social work. I want to help others the way you helped me. With all my heart, Danielle, I set the letter down, my throat tight with emotion I hadn't expected. I reread it twice, then once more, letting the words settle deep into the quiet corners of my being. This was what Carl had meant, not with clauses or conditions, but with that persistent belief that love doesn't always return the way you expect it. Sometimes it comes from strangers. Sometimes it arrives in letters, long after the storm has passed. In that moment, I realized the inheritance I'd left wasn't a check or a property title. It was a ripple, a life I'd never touched directly, now shaped by the choices I made. And it was enough. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed, a number I hadn't seen in nearly 6 months. Drew. I let it ring once, twice, a third time. Then silence. No voicemail, just the echo of an old rhythm, one I no longer danced to. That evening, he sent a message. Hey, just wondering if we could talk. Hope you're well. I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no anger, no urgency, no pain, only distance and the soft hum of finality. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had nothing left to explain. Forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means freedom. I walked to the window, the sun stretching low across the sky. The apartment glowed in the late light, walls warm, shadows long. My journal sat open on the side table, today's entry half written. I picked it up. Today I received a letter from a girl I'll never meet. She thanked me for saving her life, not knowing she helped save mine too. I wonder how many other women have rewritten their own endings, just like I did. Quiet revolutions, hidden in plain sight. I paused. Then I wrote the final line. I didn't lose a son. I found myself. I closed the journal. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt whole. If this story made you pause, question, or feel something too long buried, don't let it end here. Share it with someone still waiting for their worth to be seen. Let this be more than a narrative. Let it be a mirror. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we finally refuse to carry forward.